When Jonathan Roumie revealed what really happened to him while filming Jesus in The Chosen, Bishop Barron broke down in tears on live television. The confession was so shocking that it silenced the entire studio and went viral within hours as millions couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. This wasn't about acting technique or career success. Jonathan had just admitted to mystical encounters with Christ himself that left even the unshakable Bishop Barron completely speechless. What the cameras captured next would change how the world saw both men forever. But to understand how that earth-shattering moment came to be, we need to go back 3 weeks, when Jonathan was quietly preparing for what he assumed would be just another interview about The Chosen's success. But something profound had been stirring in his heart, something he'd never shared with anyone. The lines between actor and the Christ he portrayed had begun to blur in ways that both terrified and transformed him. In his jacket pocket sat a small wooden cross, carved by a child whose family credited the show with bringing them back to faith. Bishop Barron had specifically requested Jonathan for his show, fascinated by reports of conversions sparked by the series. He'd prepared thoughtful questions about portraying Christ and the show's theological accuracy, planning to explore how modern media could serve as a pathway to encountering the divine. Neither man anticipated this conversation would become a watershed moment that would change everything. As Jonathan sat in the green room that morning, he found himself praying not for a good performance, but for courage to be completely honest about what God was doing in his life. The weight of thousands of letters from viewers whose lives had been changed by the show pressed on his heart. He had begun to realize that playing Jesus wasn't just about acting anymore. It had become a calling that was reshaping his entire understanding of faith. Bishop Barron had planned to focus on theological aspects and pastoral opportunities, having watched every episode multiple times and taken notes on its potential as a tool for evangelization. He saw this as an opportunity to validate the series' role in modern ministry while providing theological context. What he didn't expect was that Jonathan would turn the conversation into something far more personal and profound than academic discussion. As the cameras rolled and the interview began, Bishop Barron opened with his characteristic warmth and intellectual curiosity, welcoming Jonathan to the show and praising the impact of The Chosen on viewers worldwide. "Jonathan, your portrayal of Jesus has touched millions of hearts and sparked countless conversations about faith," the bishop began, his voice carrying the gentle authority that had made him a beloved figure in Catholic media. "Tell us about your preparation for this role and how you approach the responsibility of bringing Christ to life on screen." Jonathan shifted slightly in his chair, the weight of the question settling over him like a familiar burden. He had answered similar questions hundreds of times before, usually focusing on research, prayer, and collaboration with biblical scholars. But today felt different. Today felt like a moment for truth, rather than talking points. "Bishop Barron, I appreciate that question, and I've given versions of that answer many times," Jonathan began, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of something deeper. "I've talked about studying Scripture, working with theologians, spending time in prayer and preparation." He paused, looking down at his hands before meeting the bishop's eyes again. "But if I'm being completely honest with you and your viewers, something has happened to me through this process that I wasn't prepared for and didn't expect." The studio seemed to lean in, sensing a shift in the conversation's tone. Bishop Barron's eyebrows raised slightly, his pastoral instincts recognizing that Jonathan was about to share something significant. "When I first auditioned for this role, I was a Catholic actor looking for work, someone who believed in God but hadn't really encountered Him in a personal way," Jonathan continued, his voice growing more vulnerable with each word. "I thought I understood what it meant to play Jesus, because I'd grown up in the church. I knew the stories. I could recite the prayers." He shifted forward in his chair, his hands clasped tightly. "But Bishop, I have to tell you, Somewhere between season 1 and now, between all those hours of studying his words and trying to embody his presence, something broke open in my heart. The camera captured the intensity in Jonathan's eyes, the way his voice caught slightly on the word broke, and Bishop Barron found himself leaning forward, completely absorbed in what he was hearing. Bishop Barron nodded encouragingly, his pastoral heart recognizing the sacred nature of what Jonathan was sharing. "Tell us about that breaking open," he said gently, his voice carrying the warmth of a confessor rather than an interviewer. "What did you discover about Jesus that you hadn't known before?" The question hung in the air, and Jonathan took a deep breath, clearly gathering courage for what he was about to reveal. Around the studio, crew members who had been focused on technical details found themselves drawn into the conversation, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. The lighting seemed softer somehow, the atmosphere charged with the kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred spaces. "I discovered that you can't fake loving Jesus," Jonathan said, his voice carrying a conviction that resonated through the studio. "You can study him, you can memorize his words, you can even portray him convincingly on screen. But if you truly want to understand him, if you want to bring authentic love to that portrayal, you have to fall in love with him yourself." He paused, his eyes glistening. "And that's what happened to me, Bishop. I fell in love with Jesus Christ in a way I never thought possible." The admission hung in the air like incense, sacred and transformative. Bishop Barron's expression softened, recognizing the profound spiritual journey Jonathan was describing. "There's a scene we filmed in Season 3 where Jesus comforts a woman who's lost everything," Jonathan continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "As I was preparing for that scene, I found myself not just thinking about how Jesus would comfort her, but actually feeling his compassion flowing through me." He touched his chest right over his heart. "It was like he was using my body, my voice, my presence to love this actress playing a broken woman. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't acting anymore." The studio was completely silent except for the soft hum of cameras, everyone present sensing they were witnessing a testimony rather than an interview. Bishop Barron's eyes were bright with unshed tears, recognizing the work of the Holy Spirit in Jonathan's words. Bishop Barron leaned back slightly, his voice thick with emotion as he processed what Jonathan had shared. "What you're describing sounds like what the mystics call union with Christ," he said, his theological training providing context for the spiritual experience Jonathan was recounting. "It's one thing to know about Jesus intellectually, and another entirely to experience that kind of intimate connection with his heart." Jonathan nodded eagerly, grateful that the bishop understood what he was trying to express. "Exactly, and it scared me at first," Jonathan admitted. "I remember calling my spiritual director and asking if what I was experiencing was normal, if it was okay to feel this close to Jesus through acting." The conversation was taking on the quality of spiritual direction, both men forgetting about the cameras as they explored the mysteries of faith and calling. "You know, Bishop, there were days on set when I would finish filming a scene and realize I had been praying the entire time," Jonathan continued, his voice filled with wonder at his own experience. "Not preparing to pray or thinking about prayer, but actually in communion with Christ while the cameras were rolling." He ran his hand through his hair, a gesture that seemed to ground him in the present moment. "The crew would call cut, and I would need a few moments to come back to myself because I had been so completely present with Jesus during the scene." Bishop Barron nodded knowingly, having heard similar testimonies from contemplatives and mystics throughout church history. The authenticity of Jonathan's experience was written across his face, unmistakable in its sincerity. But the real transformation happened when I realized that this connection couldn't be confined to the set, Jonathan said, his voice growing more intense. "Jesus didn't just want me to portray him for a few hours a day. He wanted all of me, all the time." He looked directly at Bishop Barron, then into the camera, as if addressing every viewer personally. I started waking up in the morning and feeling his presence before I even opened my eyes. I'd find myself having conversations with him throughout the day, not formal prayers, but just talking to him like he was right there beside me. If you've ever experienced that kind of personal connection with Jesus, comment the word present below. The intimacy Jonathan described was so palpable that several crew members found themselves wiping away tears, moved by the genuine love in his voice. "There's something else, Bishop, something I've never shared publicly before," Jonathan said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, forcing everyone in the studio to lean in to hear him. "Sometimes, when I'm filming, especially during the more emotionally intense scenes, I can feel Jesus grieving through me." He paused, struggling to find words for the experience. "When we filmed the scene where Jesus sees the suffering of his people, I found myself weeping not just as an actor trying to convey emotion, but because I could actually feel Christ's broken heart over human pain." The vulnerability in Jonathan's voice was heartbreaking, and Bishop Barron found his own eyes filling with tears as he witnessed this profound sharing of mystical experience. The studio had become a sacred space, transformed by the honesty and depth of Jonathan's testimony. Bishop Barron reached across and placed a gentle hand on Jonathan's arm, his voice soft with pastoral care. "Jonathan, what you're describing is extraordinarily rare and beautiful," he said, his words carrying the weight of theological understanding and personal compassion. "You're experiencing what St. Paul meant when he said, 'It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me.'" The bishop's validation seemed to unlock something deeper in Jonathan, who nodded with tears now flowing freely. "Yes, that's exactly it," Jonathan said. "I'm not the same person who auditioned for this role 5 years ago. Jesus has been transforming me from the inside out, using this show, this portrayal, as a pathway into my heart." The exchange between the two men had transcended the bounds of television, becoming a moment of mutual recognition of God's work in unexpected ways. "You know what's amazing, Bishop?" Jonathan continued, his voice gaining strength despite his tears. "I've received thousands of letters from people who say watching the show has changed their relationship with Jesus, that seeing him portrayed with such love and authenticity has made him real to them in new ways." He pulled the small wooden cross from his pocket, holding it up for the camera to see. "This was carved by a 7-year-old boy whose family wrote to tell me that watching The Chosen helped them start going to church again after years away from faith." The simple cross caught the studio lights, seeming to glow as Jonathan held it. But here's what they don't know. Every single one of those letters is really a testimony to what Jesus is doing, not what I'm doing. I'm just the vessel he's chosen to use. The humility in Jonathan's words struck Bishop Barron powerfully, and he found himself thinking about the countless ways God works through imperfect human instruments to accomplish his perfect will. "That's the heart of authentic ministry," the bishop said, his voice carrying the authority of years of theological study and pastoral experience. "When we become transparent enough that people can see Jesus through us rather than seeing us." Jonathan nodded vigorously, clearly grateful for the bishop's understanding. "Exactly, and that's what I want people to understand about this show, about any authentic portrayal of Christ," Jonathan said. "It's not about my acting ability or the production values or even the storytelling, though those things matter. It's about creating space for Jesus to encounter people directly." The conversation had moved far beyond typical celebrity interview territory into the realm of theological reflection and spiritual testimony. "Bishop, can I share something that happened just last week?" Jonathan asked, his voice carrying an urgency that suggested the story was particularly meaningful to him. Bishop Barron nodded encouragingly, sensing that whatever Jonathan was about to share would be significant. "I was at a coffee shop in Los Angeles. just trying to have a quiet morning, when a woman approached me. Jonathan began. She was probably in her 60s, well-dressed. Looked like she had everything together. But when she started talking, I could see the pain in her eyes. The studio remained completely silent, everyone present drawn into the intimacy of Jonathan's storytelling. She told me that she had lost her faith after her son died in a car accident 2 years ago, that she couldn't understand how a loving God could allow such tragedy. I listened to her story, and honestly, Bishop, I didn't know what to say. Jonathan continued, his voice filled with the remembered emotion of the encounter. How do you respond to that kind of pain? What words could possibly bring comfort? He looked directly at Bishop Barron, seeking understanding. But then something happened that I can only describe as miraculous. I found myself not searching for words, but simply being present with her in her grief, the way I had learned to be present with Jesus during filming. Bishop Barron nodded, recognizing the spiritual wisdom in Jonathan's approach. Presence is often more powerful than words, the bishop offered. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone is simply to be with them in their pain. Jonathan's eyes lit up with recognition of this truth. That's exactly what happened, Jonathan said, his voice growing more animated as he continued the story. I didn't try to explain away her pain or offer easy answers about God's plan. Instead, I just sat with her and let her talk about her son, about her anger, about her questions. He paused, clearly moved by the memory. And as I listened, I realized that Jesus was there with us, not fixing everything or making the pain go away, but simply being present in the midst of it. The profound simplicity of the moment wasn't lost on Bishop Barron, who had spent years studying the theology of suffering and the mystery of God's presence in human pain. That's the incarnation in action, the bishop said softly. Jesus doesn't promise to eliminate suffering, but he promises never to leave us alone in it. After about 20 minutes, she looked at me and said something I'll never forget. Jonathan continued, his voice thick with emotion. She said, "You know, talking to you feels like talking to Jesus himself, not because you have all the answers, but because you're not afraid of my questions." Tears began streaming down Jonathan's face as he recalled her words. "Bishop, I drove home that day overwhelmed by what had happened. Here was this woman who had lost her faith, and somehow, through our conversation, she was beginning to see Jesus again. The power of the testimony was evident not just in Jonathan's words, but in his entire being, which seemed to radiate the love he was describing." Bishop Barron found himself deeply moved, recognizing the work of the Holy Spirit in this chance encounter. "But here's what really broke me open," Jonathan said, his voice now barely above a whisper. "As I was driving home, I realized that the reason I could be present with her pain was because Jesus had been teaching me, through all those scenes of filming his suffering, how to enter into human anguish without trying to fix it or flee from it." He looked directly into the camera, his eyes blazing with conviction. "Every time I portrayed Jesus comforting someone, every time I had to embody his compassion for the broken and hurting, he was preparing me for that moment with that woman." The theological implications of what Jonathan was sharing weren't lost on Bishop Barron, who recognized that he was hearing a testimony of how God uses art and media as vehicles for spiritual formation and ministry. Bishop Barron leaned forward, his expression one of wonder and deep theological appreciation. "Jonathan, what you're describing is extraordinary," he said, his voice carrying both pastoral warmth and scholarly excitement. "You're talking about how God used your artistic work as a form of spiritual direction, preparing you for real-world ministry through fictional portrayal." Jonathan nodded eagerly, grateful that the bishop understood the profound nature of what he had experienced. "Yes, exactly. And it made me realize that Jesus doesn't just want us to act like him or think about him or even worship him," Jonathan said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "He wants to live through us, to love through us, to encounter people through us. The studio felt charged with the energy of this revelation, as if the air itself had become thinner, more sacred. "You know, Bishop, there are days when I wake up and forget that I'm an actor playing a role," Jonathan continued, his honesty both startling and beautiful. "I find myself asking, what would Jesus do today? How would he respond to this situation? How would he love this person?" He gestured with his hands as he spoke, his entire body animated by the passion of his testimony. And then I realize that those aren't questions for filming. Those are questions for living. Jesus has been using this role to teach me how to be his disciple in real life. Bishop Barron sat back in his chair, clearly processing the profound implications of what Jonathan was sharing. The idea that God could use the portrayal of Christ as a pathway to authentic discipleship was both theologically sound and practically revolutionary. "There's something else, Bishop, something that might sound crazy, but I know is true," Jonathan said, his voice carrying a note of holy boldness. "Sometimes, when I'm in prayer now, I don't just talk to Jesus about my problems or ask for his help. I find myself asking him to show me how to love people the way he loves them." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the studio. And he does. He shows me things about people that I would never notice on my own, their hidden pain, their desperate need for acceptance, their longing to be truly seen and valued. The intimacy of this prayer life that Jonathan was describing moved Bishop Barron deeply, recognizing in it the marks of authentic mystical experience. "That's the gift of contemplative prayer," the bishop said softly, "when we learn to see with Christ's eyes rather than our own." "Last month we were filming a scene where Jesus encounters a tax collector," Jonathan continued, his storytelling now taking on the quality of spiritual testimony. "As I was preparing for the scene, I found myself thinking about all the people in my own life who are dismissed or judged by others." His voice grew more intense, more personal. "And I realized that Jesus wasn't just calling me to portray his love for outcasts. He was calling me to actually love the outcasts in my own world." The application was clearly profound for Jonathan, whose entire demeanor had shifted from that of an actor discussing his work to that of a disciple sharing his transformation. Bishop Barron recognized the movement from performance to personal conversion that was at the heart of Jonathan's testimony. "Bishop, I have to tell you something that happened during filming that scene," Jonathan said, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Right in the middle of the take, I found myself thinking about my neighbor. This guy who's always angry, always complaining, someone I've been avoiding because he's so difficult to be around." He paused, clearly moved by the memory. "And suddenly I could feel Jesus' heart for this man, could see past his anger to his loneliness and fear. Right there, with cameras rolling, Jesus was teaching me to love my actual neighbor through loving this fictional tax collector." The profound integration of art and spirituality that Jonathan was describing left Bishop Barron speechless for a moment, recognizing that he was witnessing testimony to one of the most beautiful examples of how God can use creative work for spiritual formation. "When they called cut on that scene, I knew I had to go home and knock on that man's door," Jonathan continued, his voice filled with the excitement of someone who had experienced divine leading. "I didn't know what I would say, but I knew Jesus wanted me to reach out to him." He leaned forward, engaging Bishop Barron directly. "So I did. I went over that evening and just asked if he was okay, if there was anything he needed." The simple obedience to divine prompting that Jonathan was describing struck Bishop Barron as exemplifying the kind of lived discipleship that transformed communities. "And what happened?" the bishop asked, clearly invested in the outcome of this story. "He broke down and cried," Jonathan said, his own voice breaking with emotion. "Turns out his wife had been diagnosed with dementia 6 months earlier, and he'd been carrying this burden alone, too proud and too scared to ask for help." Tears were now flowing freely down Jonathan's face as he continued. We spent 2 hours talking that night, and by the end, he was asking me to pray with him. This man who I had written off as just angry and difficult was actually drowning in fear and grief, and Jesus used a scene from our show to open my eyes to see him the way God sees him. The power of this testimony was evident throughout the studio, where crew members were openly weeping at the beauty of how God had orchestrated this encounter. Bishop Barron himself was deeply moved, recognizing the profound way that grace had worked through art to produce real-world compassion and ministry. "But here's what really gets me, Bishop," Jonathan said, his voice now carrying a note of holy awe. "That scene we filmed, the one that opened my heart to my neighbor, it's one that viewers have responded to more powerfully than almost any other. Hundreds of people have written to tell us that watching Jesus love that tax collector helped them see difficult people in their own lives differently." He spread his hands as if trying to encompass the magnitude of what he was realizing. Jesus was using that fictional scene to teach real people, including me, how to love in real life. The same grace that was working in me during filming was somehow transmitted through the screen to touch hearts all over the world. This recognition of how God's grace could work through media to touch multiple hearts simultaneously left Bishop Barron marveling at the mysterious ways divine love operates in the modern world. Bishop Barron sat in profound silence for a moment, clearly processing the theological and pastoral implications of what Jonathan had shared. "Jonathan, what you're describing is nothing short of miraculous," he finally said, his voice heavy with wonder and theological appreciation. "You're talking about art becoming sacramental, about creative work, becoming a vehicle for actual grace." Jonathan nodded vigorously, grateful for the bishop's theological framework for understanding his experience. "Yes, that's exactly it," Jonathan exclaimed. "It's like Jesus took this television show and turned it into a form of prayer, a way of encountering him that reaches people who might never step foot in a church." The revolutionary potential of this understanding wasn't lost on Bishop Barron, who had spent years thinking about how the church could engage modern culture in meaningful ways. "You know what I think is happening, Bishop?" Jonathan said, his voice taking on a prophetic quality that seemed to fill the studio with anticipation. "I think Jesus is using The Chosen and stories like it to prepare people's hearts for a deeper encounter with Him, not as a substitute for the sacraments or the church, but as a doorway into them." He gestured with his hands as he spoke, his passion evident in every movement. "I've gotten letters from people who started going to Mass again after watching the show, from families who began praying together, from couples who rediscovered their faith together." Bishop Barron's eyes lit up with recognition of the evangelistic potential Jonathan was describing. "That's the new evangelization in action," the bishop said, "using the tools of culture to lead people to the truths of faith. But Bishop, here's what I really want people to understand," Jonathan said, his voice growing more urgent, more personal. "This transformation didn't happen because I'm special or holy or particularly gifted. It happened because I said yes to Jesus, because I let Him use even my work as an actor to draw me closer to His heart." He looked directly into the camera, addressing viewers with the intensity of someone delivering a crucial message. Every single person watching this can have the same kind of relationship with Jesus that I'm describing. He's not just waiting for us in church on Sunday. He wants to be part of every moment of our lives, every conversation, every decision. The universal application of Jonathan's testimony was clearly important to him, and Bishop Barron recognized the evangelical heart behind his words. "There's something else I need to share, something that might be hard for people to understand," Jonathan continued, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone. "Sometimes, when I'm portraying Jesus, especially during the more intense emotional scenes, I feel like I disappear completely, and He takes over." He paused, clearly searching for words to describe an indescribable experience. It's not that I lose consciousness or anything dramatic like that. It's more like my ego, my self-awareness, just steps aside and lets him love through me completely. The mystical nature of what Jonathan was describing left Bishop Barron speechless for a moment, recognizing that he was hearing testimony to one of the highest forms of spiritual experience. "That sounds like what the mystics call ecstatic union," the bishop said softly. "It's what happens when the soul becomes so united with God that the boundaries between self and divine love become almost invisible." "Yes, and those are the moments when the most powerful scenes happen," Jonathan said, his voice filled with reverence for the mystery he was describing. "When I get out of the way completely and just let Jesus love through me, that's when people on set start crying, when the other actors tell me later that they felt like they were actually in the presence of Christ." He reached up and wiped tears from his eyes, clearly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was sharing. "Bishop, I know how this sounds, and I know some people might think I'm being presumptuous or even blasphemous, but I can't deny what I've experienced." The courage it took for Jonathan to share something so personal and potentially controversial wasn't lost on Bishop Barron, who recognized the authentic marks of mystical experience in his testimony. "Jonathan, there's nothing blasphemous about what you're describing," Bishop Barron said with the authority of his theological training and pastoral experience. "What you're talking about is exactly what St. Paul meant when he said we are called to put on Christ, to become so united with him that his life becomes our life." The validation in the bishop's voice seemed to strengthen Jonathan, who nodded with visible relief. "The fact that this is happening through your artistic work just shows how God can use anything, any vocation, any calling, to draw souls into deeper union with himself." The theological affirmation Jonathan was receiving seemed to unlock something even deeper in his heart, preparing him for what would become the most powerful moment of the entire interview. "Bishop, there's one more thing I need to tell you. Something that happened just 3 days ago," Jonathan said, his voice now trembling with emotion as he prepared to share what was clearly the most significant part of his testimony. "We were filming the crucifixion scene for the upcoming season, and as I was hanging on that cross, something happened that I can't explain in ordinary terms." The studio fell into absolute silence, everyone present sensing that Jonathan was about to share something profound and sacred. Bishop Barron leaned forward, his entire being focused on Jonathan's words, recognizing that they were approaching the heart of his spiritual journey. "I need you to understand, this wasn't acting anymore. This was something else entirely. As I hung there, trying to portray the physical and emotional agony that Jesus endured, I suddenly felt a weight that had nothing to do with the cross or the physical position," Jonathan continued, tears now flowing freely down his face. "It was like every sin I had ever committed, every way I had failed to love, every moment I had chosen myself over God, came crashing down on me all at once." His voice broke as he struggled to continue, and Bishop Barron found himself reaching across to place a comforting hand on Jonathan's shoulder. "But Bishop, that wasn't even the most overwhelming part. What broke me completely was feeling, just for a moment, the weight of love that Jesus carried for every single person who had ever lived." The rawness of Jonathan's emotion was palpable throughout the studio, where crew members stood transfixed by the power of his testimony. "I realized that when Jesus hung on that cross, he wasn't just dying for humanity in general," Jonathan said, his voice gaining strength even as tears continued to flow. "He was thinking about every individual person. About you, Bishop. About every person in this studio. About every viewer watching this right now." He looked directly into the camera, his eyes blazing with the intensity of his conviction. "He was thinking about the woman I met in the coffee shop, about my angry neighbor, about every person who would ever struggle with faith or doubt or pain." The personal nature of Christ's love that Jonathan was describing struck Bishop Barron with fresh force, even though he had preached about it countless times. And in that moment, hanging on that prop cross on a television set, I felt just a tiny fraction of that love, and it nearly destroyed me. I started sobbing uncontrollably, Jonathan continued, his voice barely audible as he relived the profound experience. The director called cut, but I couldn't stop crying. For almost an hour I just hung there weeping, not from physical pain but from being overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Jesus did for us. He paused, gathering himself before continuing. Every person on that set knew they were witnessing something sacred. The other actors, the crew, even the director. Everyone was crying because we could all feel the presence of Christ in that moment. Bishop Barron's own tears were flowing freely now, recognizing that Jonathan had experienced something mystical and transformative. That wasn't acting, Bishop. That was Jesus letting me share, just for a moment, in his actual suffering and love for humanity. But here's what changed everything, Jonathan said, his voice suddenly strong and clear despite his tears. As I was hanging there, overwhelmed by this experience, I heard his voice as clearly as I'm hearing my own right now. The claim was bold, potentially controversial, but the sincerity in Jonathan's voice was undeniable. He said, "Jonathan, this is why I chose you for this role. Not because you're a great actor, but because you have a heart that can receive and share my love. I want you to help people understand that this love is real, that it's personal, that it's for them." Bishop Barron sat in stunned silence, recognizing that Jonathan was describing a direct mystical encounter with Christ. The theological implications were staggering, but the fruits of the experience, Jonathan's transformed life and ministry, seemed to validate its authenticity. "When I finally came down from that cross, I knew my life had been changed forever," Jonathan concluded, his voice now carrying a note of holy authority that filled the studio. "I wasn't just an actor playing Jesus anymore. I was a man who had been personally commissioned by Christ himself to use this platform, this gift, this opportunity to help people encounter his love." He looked directly at Bishop Barron, then into the camera, his eyes shining with purpose and conviction. "That's why I'm here today, Bishop. Not to talk about a television show or my career, but to tell people that Jesus Christ is alive, that his love is real, and that he wants a personal relationship with every single person watching this right now." The power of Jonathan's testimony had transformed the entire atmosphere of the studio, turning a simple interview into a moment of profound evangelization and witness to the living Christ. Bishop Barron sat in overwhelmed silence for several moments, tears streaming down his face as he processed the profound testimony he had just heard. "Jonathan," he finally managed to say, his voice thick with emotion, "in 40 years of ministry, I have rarely heard such a powerful witness to the living Christ." The bishop reached across and grasped Jonathan's hands, his own trembling with the weight of what he had witnessed. "What you've shared today isn't just inspiring, it's genuinely prophetic. You've shown us how God can use any vocation, any calling, even the entertainment industry to draw souls into deeper union with himself." The validation from such a respected theologian and bishop seemed to overwhelm Jonathan, who bowed his head in humble gratitude for the affirmation of his extraordinary spiritual journey. "I want every viewer to understand what they've just witnessed," Bishop Barron said, turning to address the camera directly, his voice carrying the authority of his episcopal office. "This isn't just an actor talking about his role. This is a man who has been genuinely transformed by an encounter with the living Christ, and who is now using his platform to invite others into that same transformative relationship." He gestured toward Jonathan, who sat quietly, still processing the magnitude of what he had shared. "This is what the new evangelization looks like. Authentic witness flowing from genuine encounter with Jesus Christ." The bishop's theological framework for understanding Jonathan's experience seemed to provide both men with a sense of completion, as if the testimony had found its proper context within the broader mission of the church. As the interview drew to a close, Jonathan pulled out the small wooden cross again, holding it up for the camera one final time. "Bishop Barron, I want to leave your viewers with this," he said, his voice steady and filled with purpose. "This cross was carved by a child who found Jesus through our show, but the real miracle isn't the show itself. The real miracle is that Jesus is still reaching out to each of us, still calling us into relationship with Him, still wanting to transform our lives just like He transformed mine." He set the cross on the table between them, a simple symbol of the profound transformation that had taken place in his heart. If He can use a broken actor like me to touch hearts around the world, imagine what He wants to do through your life, your work, your relationships. Bishop Barron nodded in agreement, recognizing the perfect synthesis of personal testimony and universal invitation that Jonathan was offering to viewers. In the weeks following the interview, the impact of Jonathan's testimony rippled across the Catholic world and beyond. Thousands of viewers wrote to share how his honest account of encountering Jesus through his artistic work had inspired them to seek a deeper relationship with Christ in their own vocations and daily lives. Churches reported increased attendance. Spiritual directors spoke of more people seeking guidance for mystical experiences, and The Chosen itself took on new significance as viewers understood the profound spiritual formation that had taken place behind the cameras. Bishop Barron received countless messages from fellow bishops and theologians, praising the interview as one of the most powerful examples of evangelization through media they had ever witnessed. The conversation had transcended entertainment and entered the realm of genuine spiritual testimony that was bearing fruit in hearts around the world. Jonathan continued his work on The Chosen, with a transformed understanding of his calling, no longer seeing himself primarily as an actor, but as an instrument of divine love commissioned to help others encounter the living Christ. His approach to the role deepened even further, if that were possible, as he embraced his identity as both artist and evangelist. He began accepting speaking engagements at churches and Catholic events, always emphasizing that his experience was available to anyone willing to say yes to Jesus in their own circumstances. The humility with which he shared his story, always pointing away from himself toward Christ, became a hallmark of his ministry and a model for how authentic witness could transform culture. His testimony reminded people that holiness wasn't reserved for priests and religious, but was the calling of every baptized person willing to let Jesus live through them. Jonathan's testimony reveals a beautifully simple truth. Jesus isn't just a historical figure to study. He's a living person who wants intimate relationship with you right now. Whether you're an actor, teacher, parent, or student, Christ wants to live through you and transform you from the inside out. Jonathan's journey from working actor to mystical witness proves that no vocation is too ordinary, and no heart too broken for Jesus to use in extraordinary ways. The question echoing from his story is this: are you ready to let Jesus transform your daily life into opportunities for authentic encounter with His love? If this testimony touched your heart, subscribe for more incredible stories of faith and share in the comments how Jesus is working in your own life. We'd love to hear your